So we tonight are going to be talking about shelters and homelessness. So right now, what we're going to be doing is describing the homeless population. We are going to talk about different housing programs that are available and any factors that may influence the rates of homelessness, and talk a little bit about occupational therapy's role in the homeless population. Interestingly, BayPath actually has an emergent practice fieldwork who works directly with the homeless population in Connecticut. I think they work out of Manchester, Connecticut. So this is an area that OTs work in. So homelessness often can be seen as a cycle of functional impairment. So there's times where somebody is living in a home and then something happens, and there's a lot of stigma that goes around being homeless, but there's some kind of occurrence and they no longer have a home. And once you're removed from a home, it's really difficult actually to integrate back into living in a home. There are some barriers to housing services, such as lack of transportation, strict eligibility for housing, and inadequate resources. I know in the town that I live in, Enfield, Connecticut, we don't have a homeless shelter, but we have a warming center. So during the winter months, there's a church that opens its doors as a warming center. But the problem is, or the major barrier is, that this church is kind of on an isolated side of town, and we don't have a very well-developed bus system. And the bus system only runs so late. And most of the people who are homeless live in camps on the other side of town, so they're not able to get to the warming center. So there's a lot of barriers to accessing these services. And the goal is providing housing that can help to improve cognitive functioning and decrease rehospitalization, but they still require acquisition of life skills. So my question to you are, what are some ways that occupational therapy can help address issues surrounding homelessness? Any ideas on that? How can we help reduce some of those barriers?
Well, you can teach them some life skills, budgeting, grocery shopping, self-care. I don't know about job skills. It might not be appropriate at the time, but maybe how to apply for some benefits.
Absolutely. I think you hit almost on 75% of my list. So good job, Deb.
Thanks.
So financial management, budgeting, certainly organizational skills, how to effectively meal prep, grocery shopping, home management skills, self-care skills, maybe symptom management skills. These are all things that occupational therapy has the ability to help with. The most accessible frameworks or models, all again come from Canada. So not MOHO, PEO, occupational justice. Some of those models really focus on meeting clients where they are. In fact, Canada's healthcare system has pretty robust funding for community-based services. And so OTs exist there very simply to help connect people with these different services. I read a really interesting case. It was a sad case of somebody who was actually a veteran. And it's like a series of misfortunate events. He lost his paperwork, he lost his identification, was trying to kind of rebuild, but without some of that formal paperwork, he wasn't able to apply for jobs, but he didn't have transportation, so he couldn't get to the places that, you know, he could apply for the paperwork. Then he had no money. And so he couldn't even pay for the fees to get his paperwork. And it just ended up in a really vicious cycle. So sometimes people, even if they have really strong management skills, if they don't have those supports, especially, you know, transportation, it's a cycle that feels really difficult to get out of.
Sarah, so in a case like that where they, if they don't have any money or anything and they need transportation and stuff like that, so where do they end up getting this from?
Great question. So there's a variety of sources that can help fund transportation or connect with transportation services. Whatever town that you're working in, you want to see if they have a local community organization, because a lot of times the community organizations serve as kind of like a center point where, as long as they can get there, it's like a one-stop shop for signing up for all sorts of social services and supports that are available. A lot of times churches will have like funds or like bus passes available. I know the warming center that I was referencing earlier also has bus passes. So they will hand those out. So churches will do that, community centers, you know, other nonprofit agencies. It's just helping people to get connected. And some, you know, it's difficult even to ask for that help. But those are all options.
Okay.
I would always look to see if there's a community center, because they're wonderful organizations, usually nonprofit organizations, that you don't have to like piece things together. They will piece it together for you.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know.
Yep. No problem. So, any other questions or insights before we move on? Right. If you do ask something, again, if you ask something in the chat, I won't see it when I have the PowerPoint on, but when I come back, I will see it. So I'll make sure to address your question. Okay. So there's two types of housing programs that are available. There's homeless shelters and there's transitional housing. The difference is homeless shelters, their primary mission is to provide temporary and safe housing. Typically, the length of stay is between 1 night and 30 days. And some of the restrictions that are in place in homeless shelters may be things like you have to be in the shelter by 5 o'clock in the evening, or you know, you can't have visitors. They usually have a lot of restrictions placed on them, typically for safety for their residents. Transitional houses, the primary mission of a transitional house is to promote housing stability. A lot of time, many of these programs offer temporary housing for up to 2 years. Usually, transitional housing has a specific population they're focused on. So it could be people with mental health disorders. It could be domestic violence survivors. It could be veterans. It could be people recovering from substance abuse addictions. But usually this is a safe space to land while people get back on their feet and they can stay there. I worked in a really interesting, I did actually level 1 and level 2 field work with a shelter for teen moms. And so the mothers were there with their children. And they could, and actually that housing, they could stay there for up to 4 years. A really great program. So here is an example of a shelter. This is the Road Home Shelter. and they have their bunk set up. Everybody, it's not very private, but it is a safe space to be. And it's well lit, and everybody works together to clean the space. It's warm. Oftentimes meals are included. Hygiene products are offered. You can take a shower. A lot of people will donate items of clothing. So it's a good, if your clothing is a bit worn down. It's also a place where people can come, like I was talking about the community organizations. Often social workers will be connected with these shelters in order to help people begin to access their services. So the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act defines a homeless person as an individual who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, and a person who has a nighttime residence that is A, supervised publicly or privately in an operated shelter designed to provide temporary living accommodations, B, an institution that provides temporary residence for individuals intended to be institutionalized, or C, a public or private place not designed for ordinarily used regular sleeping accommodations for human beings. The population varies in demographics, subgroups, and patterns. 50% of people are episodically homeless, meaning that they're only homeless for one night. So maybe something happened in their home and they needed to transition to a shelter, but they were able to secure a safe place to live for the next day. 50% of people are chronically homeless. They are continuously homeless for over 1 year. Okay. So the demographics include men, they include women with children, and especially children under 18. 39% of people who are homeless are actually women with their children. They can either be in a shelter because they're homeless, or oftentimes they are in shelters due to domestic violence. Adults with mental illness. So 61 to 90% of people who are homeless present with some type of psychiatric disability. They tend to spend more days homeless, have lower quality of life. They have difficulties with meeting basic needs. Some reasons that people diagnosed with mental illness may lose their housing include not being able to pay rent due to inadequate finances, or cognitive or behavioral limitations, inability to successfully complete their IADLs, inadequate preparation, isolation, and a lack of meaningful occupation. And they also could have issues, up to 30% have issues with alcoholism, and a quarter of them may have issues with drugs. So my question to you, we'll stop right there, is how can an occupational therapist address the needs of somebody with a mental illness in order to help them maintain a home based on, so we talked about some of those different diagnoses. So we know some of the challenges that they have. How can we help support them?
I would say like maybe have them. I'm sorry, this is an echo for me, so it's hard because I hear everything I'm saying.
Okay.
So just bear with me.
That's frustrating. Sorry.
So I would think if you made a schedule with them, so they had a routine each day that they could follow, might be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Creating routines. Maribel says providing resources. Dongaset says medication management for sure. For sure. Even just education about their specific diagnosis, because, some diagnoses are kind of, well, most diagnoses actually have those acute phases. So maybe you could help them, like Amy was saying, to develop routines, maybe you have to have different sets of routines. So one for when your symptomology is like managed and maybe a little bit more regulated, and one for any kind of acute flare-up. Shelby says, learn about why they are homeless and the situation that led them there. Yeah, absolutely. That antecedent behavior, whatever happened before. Resources for addiction issues if they are present, absolutely. Self-regulation, we mentioned before, like Deb was saying, any kind of ADL and IADL. Sometimes people who have mental illness may have poor insight. So helping them develop some of that insight, helping them, even with like ADLs, like maybe, you know, sometimes it's difficult when you are in an acute phase just to take a shower. So again, like we were talking about before, establishing different routines, one for, you know, in a more regulated space and one for during an acute phase, because some of those things are really difficult. And if you're not getting up to take a shower, you're not getting up to feed yourself, you probably aren't getting up to go out to work, which means you're probably not earning income, which means you probably can't pay your rent, which probably contributes to some of the difficulties of having those acute episodes. We can provide money management education, absolutely. Great ideas. Go back to the PowerPoint. Shelters often serve as havens for people who are survivors of domestic violence. Statistics say that 5 million women experience domestic violence. And there are oftentimes when somebody is a survivor of domestic violence, there are disorders that occur because of the violence, such as depression, anxiety, PTSD, and there's substantial difficulty with daily living tasks. A lot of times their abusers may have controlled the household. And so these victims may not know how to manage their household, and they have difficulty meeting work and agency requirements. Any time that there's somebody who's in a position of authority over them, even if it's, you know, completely benign, even if it's somebody who's there to help them, that can still trigger really difficult emotions in people who are survivors of domestic violence. So just being aware that their perceptions of people who are in authority have been completely altered. And so it can make it difficult maintaining a home. Families with children, we mentioned these before. This is actually the fastest growing group of people who are utilizing shelter services. Children who are in shelters often experience developmental delays in language, gross motor, fine motor, and other milestones. There is a higher infant mortality rate and higher levels of lead in the blood, upper respiratory infections, lice, skin lesions, emotional distress, depression, and behavioral problems. I will say that I've been actually in a couple of shelters. Like I said, I was telling you before, one was for teen parents who were homeless. The other was actually a home for people who were a parent. It was actually just moms and their children, and the moms were going through the recovery process for their substance addiction. And both of those shelters really worked hard to make a very comfortable and clean and supportive environment for the people, not just the women who were living there, but their children. The youth is another large population. As of the research, the most current research, there's almost 2.5 million children who are homeless. Some of the reasons that a child may become homeless include abuse and neglect when they are on the streets. It is incredibly unsafe. They are open to physical and sexual assault. And some of the survival skills, and I want to say this and be specific, that these are survival skills for children who are homeless, include prostitution, theft, drugs, and gang membership. And while this is not necessarily something that is, I think it's important to highlight the fact that they're survival skills. We obviously wish that they had different choices to make, and it's humbling to be able to provide these children with different resources. I'll stop for a second. So when I was working inpatient, a lot of my boys were homeless, and a lot of them were in gangs, and it was just the only family that they ever knew. And I'm not here to say, like, I don't think as OTs, we necessarily are here to judge right and wrong, but just to acknowledge that in that moment, that's what they were doing to survive. And sometimes that can be really hard, especially because of some of the activities that are done by gangs, but these children also need our help. So, go back to that. So some of the stereotypes of people who are utilizing shelter services because they are homeless are that they are lazy, that they are dangerous, that they're actively choosing to be homeless, and that they're currently on drugs. While some of these things may be true, some people do actively choose to be homeless. Some people who are homeless may be dangerous, maybe due to whatever diagnosis. And they also may be using drugs. There's many people who are homeless who are very well educated. They're clean, they're sober, they have solid work histories. And so again, it's just important to make sure that as occupational therapists, we're checking our biases and making sure that we are not judging people before we've met them or judging them on a first impression just because we know that they are homeless. Oh. I'm sorry, I didn't go through the slides. I just talked through them all. I apologize. So some external factors that are affecting people and creating situations of homelessness include employment wages. So there's been actually since there's been some increases, because I know Connecticut is 10-10, but I will share this with you. So my son works full-time, minimum wage, 10-10. There is no way that he can support himself independently. At minimum, he has to have at least one other roommate, and to be a little more comfortable, he needs to have another, so 3 people total. It's really expensive to live. And so sometimes people just can't get ahead of their bills and can't support independent living. And then, maybe their parents or their family members can't support them either. They're going through their own stuff. I would never, not everybody has the ability to take people into their homes. So that certainly, does anybody else does that make sense? That the way wages are today with cost of living kind of a recipe for homelessness? No? Yes?
Yeah, I would agree. My daughter is 25, 26. She could never go out on her own. She makes more than minimum wage, but the rents are so high. Just to get the rent, I think, would take all of her month's paychecks.
Mm-hmm.
Like $1,000 or something like that just for an apartment.
Yep. Yeah, I think I saw rent in Enfield was something like around $1,000 for a single bedroom, and I was like, There's a apartment facility that's down the road that a 2-bedroom was $1,600. We don't live anywhere fancy. Like, what do you mean? It's oh yeah, New York. What's a typical rent in New York? Ah, ah, 1,800 for a 1-bedroom. Oh my God. You would have to have the equivalent of probably like 4 full-time jobs. That's wild.
I know probably 15 years ago, my cousin was living in Manhattan and it was just a studio apartment. And back then it was $1,800 a month. And that was 15 years ago. And it was just a little tiny studio. I mean, everything was right like in one room.
Oh my gosh. It's wild to me. And it's, it kind of, it puts it into perspective how hard it is. I mean, I think that I'm incredibly fortunate that, the first time I moved out, I was with my husband. So we always have had, I've never experienced being a single earner. And I just can't even imagine. Well, I take that back. I'm a single earner now for my family, but thankfully I'm an OT, so that's okay. And pretty soon, couple months, you'll all be OTs too. But that's part of the reason why we do this. I mean, let's be honest with each other. Like financial reasons is probably a big motivator it was for me. It was probably the number one reason why I made this change. But not everybody has access. I acknowledge that not everybody has access. So it's sad and understandable that people go through this. So employment wages are not very high. Housing is going up. We're losing our social supports. This we know. This is from 2014. And so it was like, let me see, what does it say for New York? Oh, I don't even agree with that anymore. So it's saying that you have to earn $24 an hour in order to even be able to rent a fair market apartment, 2 bedrooms. I would think that's higher. Oh, for sure. It says Connecticut, $23 an hour. It's wild to me. All right, so who are some of the team members in a shelter that may be helping somebody who's experiencing homelessness? The roles, the credentials, the titles, all of these things can be vary greatly. There's often greater need than supply. And I'll tell you why. The reason is that there's often high staff turnover rate because of high stress being due to being overworked and underpaid. I think probably a lot of us resonate with that. And a lot of these shelters are supported through grants. There's fluctuations in funding. And so people obviously want to find a job that they have a little more security in. So OT can be direct or indirect. You can be providing groups. You could be providing one-on-one. You may have a certified alcohol and drug counselor on staff to help people support a substance-free lifestyle, maybe some employment counselors, legal advocates, and there are a lot of volunteers who are involved in this process. So as I mentioned before, some funding sources include HUD, the Department of Human and Health Services. It can be your state government, your local government. We know day to day, we're finding out that some of the financial supports to these programs are being removed. So Yeah. Unfortunately, shelters are always kind of an unstable place to work as far as payment goes. So the role of occupational therapy includes training in independent living skills, employment intervention. Like, for example, if our client is somebody who's living, who has been diagnosed with a mental illness, we may be able to connect with their employer and say, hey, here are their strengths and they need these accommodations. And so helping the people kind of help themselves and advocate for themselves for reasonable accommodations. The case manager approach helps to initiate referrals and merge practical and direct supports for community living. Take some proactive individualized intervention. So this is more one-on-one to help somebody acquire and maintain housing, develop skills based on the need of the client. And any kind of program should be very flexible, allow for contact with staff, allow for support of independent living skills. We may also be providing interventions to families with children. You may be an EI, OT coming into a shelter and giving direct services. We will certainly evaluate our client holistically, assessing all areas of function, ADLs and IADLs, design treatment plans, provide interventions, and eventually discharge them from service. Or we can be more of a consultative approach and look at environmental management, programming recommendations, treatment of the specific person. We can also do group treatment as a consultation, so consulting people about different types of groups to run. Assessments identify the client's strengths and limitations, looking at physical, mental, cognitive, social, functional, and functional challenges. One tool that can be used, so we have the ACL, the COPM, the MOHOST, which is the Model of Human Occupation Screening Tool. So again, based on the model or framework that you are using, you may pick a tool. The MOHOST includes interview and observation to help determine the baseline of functioning and needs. Then you have the Independent Living Skills Survey and the Occupational Self-Assessment. I would just make sure that you know these and the difference between like what basically you would use these for. The MOHOST, the ILSS, and the OSA. So there are, in addition to the models and frameworks that we can use in occupational therapy, there's also the empowerment theory and the situation learning theory. Empowerment theory is appropriate for groups who have been oppressed, such as those who are homeless or domestic violence survivors. There's an emphasis on social action, individual justice, and active participation and control and intervention. OTs provide opportunities for the client to direct their own care, help client learn to be assertive, and obtain information needed. So there's a lot of, in empowerment theory, we're really kind of building up our clients to be their own best advocates. In situated learning theory, adult learners gain knowledge and skills by immersing themselves in social learning community. Situated learning theory uses real-world, everyday situations. OTs will provide information and focus on the skills performed and practice those skills in a desired context. The situated learning theory allows for client choice and involvement in the skills to be addressed, didactic learning with modeling and practice, evaluation of skill in context to identify barriers and supports, an individualized process that considers client functioning. Situated learning theory can also be used to teach social skills. That there. So that is the presentation for tonight. Are there any comments, questions, or concerns that I can answer for you? Or are we all at that point of the semester where we're like, let's just get this done. We're done, let's go. Yeah, I think we are. Yep. Well, I wish you the best of luck with all your presentations and your finals. For some of you, this is my last phone call with you. So I will see you at pinning ceremony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
You too. Bye.
Bye.